Truth be told, I never thought I would be standing here today. I was a pretty anxious kid. The full-blown hyperventilating panic attack started in grade 4, but I've been living with the symptoms of anxiety for as long as I can remember. When I was younger, I coped with this by trying to be the best student I could be. I thought that if I got straight A's and 100% on every spelling test, I could somehow make up for my inability to cope with my own racing thoughts. I thought that if I could be the perfect student, that's all people would see, and they wouldn't look past it. They wouldn't see that in reality, I cringed at the thought of social interaction because it would send my head spinning and my heart racing. When I was a kid, I thought I had to be perfect. I ended up hiding a lot of myself from the outside world. I wrapped myself in the bright, shiny wrapping paper of princess dresses and painted nails. I thought that I had to be the perfect daughter, so that no one would see that on the inside, I was a boy. Clearly, the little boy who has always been inside of me got out eventually. But as a kid, the idea of opening myself up enough to let others see the real me was mortifying. It wasn't until I was 13 that the feeling of being constantly betrayed by my own body became too much. At that point, the fear of what I would become began to outweigh the fear of rejection. I was so afraid of having to live a lie for the rest of my life that suddenly the opinions of others stopped mattering so much. Here I am, close to 4 years later. I've been on hormones for nearly a year and a half, and I had top surgery this past January. This is the most comfortable I've ever felt in my own skin. And I can honestly say that this is the most authentic I've ever felt. I'm living my truth. This process hasn't been all sunshine and rainbows, no pun intended. Being vulnerable is something that I've always struggled with, and still do to this day. However, through my journey, I've often been forced to be vulnerable. From answering my concerned mother's questions to assuring my endocrinologist that yes, I am completely certain that I am not pregnant, I've had to put myself out there in order to continue moving forwards. In doing so, I've learned that there's something incredibly powerful in being vulnerable. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines vulnerability as capable of being emotionally or physically wounded. Now you're probably wondering, how can vulnerability be powerful? What kind of twisted juxtaposition is this? Why on earth would I want to be vulnerable? Those are totally valid questions. Being vulnerable is scary. But I have 3 points that hopefully illustrate why we should be more vulnerable. Number 1, being vulnerable allows you to reclaim your story. About a year and a half ago, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. While it felt good to finally have a label for my experience, it also felt incredibly isolating. The only post-traumatic narratives I'd been exposed to were those of war veterans. The kind of story where a young man goes off to war and watches his best friend die in a horrifically gory way. Then when he comes home, he's not the same person anymore. That is not my story. I lived in an abusive household for the first 15 years of my life. Not the kind of abuse that was visible to the outside world. The kind of abuse that made me wish that he would just hit me where it would leave a mark, because then others would see that something was wrong. This psychological terrorism ate away at the remnants of my childhood, leaving trust issues and triggers in its place. For a while, I kept my PTSD a secret from most of the people in my life. It made me feel tainted, as if I was somehow lesser for being so affected by my experience. It wasn't until I started sharing my experience that I began the journey to healing, a long and arduous journey that I am nowhere near finishing. This act of reclamation became a battle cry for my younger self. I was never able to speak out while I was in the thick of it, because it would have only prompted some sort of sick retribution. I choose to speak out now. By reclaiming the demons of my past, I can acknowledge them and then finally move on. Number 2. Being vulnerable allows you to make meaningful connections with others. I tend to be a fairly private person. I know, ironic given the stage I'm on. Opening up takes trust, and I don't trust others easily. When I have opened up myself up to the scrutiny of others, I've been rewarded with real and genuine connections. I share almost everything with my best friend. The good and the bad, the confusing and the crushing. From the day I was let down most and hit a punching bag until my knuckles were bruised and swollen, to the night spent in hospital after my surgery, they've stuck with me through thick and thin. They listen to me when I need them, and I try to do the same. I let myself be vulnerable around them. This is probably the closest and the healthiest friendship I've ever had. This is all because we've both chosen to be vulnerable around each other. When I've opened up more publicly, either through sharing my struggle with mental health on social media or sharing my story in the classroom, I've had the opportunity to connect with others with similar experiences. I remember this one time, shortly after I opened up about living with PTSD on social media for the first time. I got a message from this kid I barely knew. I'd met him in a different city while we were working on the same project. He messaged me just to say that he lives with anxiety and depression, and it was so hard to deal with because his family just didn't believe him. He seemed grateful just to talk to someone who could understand. You see, it's difficult to explain what it feels like to have your mind turned into a battlefield to someone who has never experienced their own thoughts turning into semi-automatics. There's a sense of solidarity when you find someone else who understands what it feels like to have your mind turn against you. Though we are bound to fight our own battles, just knowing that we are not alone in our struggle makes it that much easier to keep fighting. Number 3, being vulnerable allows you to become the person you needed to see when you were younger. When I was a kid, I didn't see anyone like me. The only trans person I knew of was Jazz Jennings, and I couldn't exactly relate to her story. I wasn't one of those kids who knew I was trans from the moment I could speak. I'd always felt that I was somehow different, but I could never quite put my finger on it. It wasn't until puberty, or at least the first one, that my brain was like, wait, what? And then dysphoria started to kick in. I'd always thought that being trans was something rare that only a handful of really special people could be. It was only when I was old enough to make use of the internet that I found people who were like me. Normal people who just happened to be trans. It was at that point that I was able to use that label for my own experience. Once I knew who I was able to move forward with coming out, then transitioning socially, and eventually medically. I know I would have realized my trans identity much sooner if I had seen someone like me. I wish that I had seen someone who had survived all the panic attacks and crippling dysphoria, because there were times I never thought I would. By being vulnerable, by being visible, I am that person for someone else. Throughout my life, I have frequently been forced to be vulnerable. I've often been in resistance to my own vulnerability because being vulnerable is incredibly daunting. But through my own experience, I have learned that vulnerability can be a kind of superpower. Being vulnerable has allowed me to reclaim and be at peace with parts of myself and my story that previously tormented me. It has allowed me to build meaningful relationships based on genuine connection. My vulnerability has allowed me to show compassion for my past self by ensuring that others will be able to see someone like them. And here I am, on a stage I never dreamed of standing upon. And I'm terrified. Terrified that someone will see this talk and think of me as lesser. Terrified that someone will use my own vulnerability against me. But I wouldn't change a single word, because this is the most free I've ever felt. Thank you.